Welcome everyone. We'll get started in just a minute or two, so just hang tight, please. Welcome everyone. I know people are still trickling in, but we're going to get started because we have a lot to cover today. I'm going to invite my panelists today to switch on your cameras for a minute and say hello, and I'm going to do some introductions and housekeeping. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Linda. And I'm going to ask, yes, everyone, thank you. All right. As everybody sort of joins and people get their videos on, speakers get their videos on, hi, Kritika. I am going to do a little bit of housekeeping. So welcome to this session, and thank you for being here in your morning, afternoon, wherever you're calling in from. I want to start. So the webinar today is about the impacts of the CSDDD for apparel and textile manufacturers. I'm going to start by backtracking a little bit. Rubia, if you could go to the next slide, please. So this webinar is really the initiative of a group of people, and that's why you see so many people, so many faces here looking at you today, or on screen, I should say. But this webinar is an extension of a resource that was launched for the first time in July of 2023, and the update to that resource was launched in July or August of 2024. And that resource is a guide for apparel and textile manufacturers to emerging sustainability legislation in the global north. It's not exhaustive. It covers 15 pieces of legislation. And it was commissioned and led by Crystal Group. So we have Kyle and Cami from Crystal Group here with us today. Diamond Fabrics Limited, Sapphire Group, and we have Saqib here from Sapphire today. Lenzing, Pactics Group, and from Pactics we have Linda here with us today. Poetic Gem, and from Poetic Gem we have Kavita. Shahi Exports, and from Shahi we have Kritika. Simple Approach, which like Poetic Gem is part of PDS Group. Sourcery, and from Sourcery we have Ruchita with support from Transformers Foundation and GIZ Fabric, and I'm here today in my capacity as Intelligence Director for Transformers Foundation. But all of that to say that this initiative really is a let's say a joint effort. So those are all of the entities who commissioned and led the report. The report, or the guide, I should say, was written by the Remedy Project. And from the Remedy Project here, we have Archana and I believe also Veronica. Yes, hi, Veronica. And Archana and Veronica are the legal brains behind this piece of work, and the Remedy Project works with governments, civil society, law enforcement, and the private sector to translate the UN guiding principles on business and human rights into practice. A quick disclaimer, the opinions expressed in this webinar or in the guide itself are collective and sort of are are messages that as a group of manufacturers leading this work, we've discussed and aligned on. But of course, somebody has to be the messenger. So all of that to say that, we don't want things that are said in this webinar to be attributed to individual companies or to spokespeople. It really is the result of sort of collective brain power on this initiative. And the other disclaimer that I'd like to give is that although this is, you'll be hearing from the Remedy Project in a moment, who are going to basically take you through. I mentioned this guide has 15 fact sheets. Each fact sheet is on a different piece of legislation. One of them is the CSDDD, and that is the fact sheet that the Remedy Project, as the authors of that guide, will be taking us through today. And then we'll hear a little bit from Kyle from Crystal Group and from Linda from Pactics about their experiences as manufacturers in trying to sort of prepare for the CSDDD. So it is a legal webinar in a sense, but it is not. We've got an hour. There's a lot to cover. So I want to manage expectations also about the level of technical advice and detail that we'll be able to give. And I also want to say that initially we had hoped to cover the German due diligence law in this webinar, and that is now no longer the case because there's just too much to talk about with the CSDDD. Rubia, could you go to the next slide, please? Okay, a brief note on why we commissioned this guide for apparel and textile manufacturers to sustainability legislation in the global north. Is because we thought it was really important, because manufacturers will ultimately be the ones who have to do much of the heavy lifting for compliance. And we also, from a sort of bigger picture lens, hope, and we'll hear more about this later in the webinar, but we hope that this resource and these kind of webinars will inspire manufacturers and suppliers to come together and to work collectively on these issues. And this report really is the first of its kind. It's supplier-led, and it was created for suppliers by suppliers. Rubia, next slide. Okay, last piece of introduction. So you can download the guide that I've been referring to in the introduction in the first QR code that you see on screen. We also hope to do more fact sheets, updates to the fact sheets, because the legislative landscape continues to evolve. So if you're interested in supporting that, please scan the middle QR code on the screen. And finally, this webinar is part of a series. We're doing a number of webinars focused on specific pieces of legislation. The next one is in December, and it will be on the Forced Labor Acts, both in the US and the EU. And so if you'd like to register for that, please scan the third QR code. And with that, Rubia, could you go to the next slide? I've already introduced everybody. So at this moment, and I've already given the disclaimers, thank you. So I'm going to invite the speakers to turn off your cameras, and we'll just have Archana from the Remedy Project, and Archana is going to take you through the fact sheets, highlights from the fact sheets, from the CSDDD fact sheet in the guide. And as I said, then we'll turn to Kyle and then to Linda to hear a bit about their experiences trying to implement. And then we're going to try and keep 20 to 30 minutes at the end for open Q&A. Okay, I think that's it.
Thank you, Kim. Can we move to the next slide, please, Rubia? So hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. So my job today is to guide you through a little bit some of the key highlights of the fact sheet on the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. It's quite a mouthful, so we refer to it affectionately as CSDDD. And what I'd like to talk to you about in particular is, where do we stand right now with this piece of law? Who does this law cover? What could be the potential enforcement relating to that? So how would the authorities enforce this piece of law? What are some of the implications for suppliers, particularly in the apparel sector? And what are the opportunities that come with some of the challenges that accompany the implementation of this law? Next, please. So in May to July 2024, the law was adopted and it entered into force. For the next 2 years, from July 2024 to July 2026, the member states of the EU have to basically implement this law in their respective national systems. What that means is essentially that they have some wiggle room to make some adaptations in the way they implement the law. For example, they could require that stakeholder engagement be present throughout the due diligence process. They could shift the burden of proof on businesses that are in scope of the law to prove that they are not responsible for violations of human rights. So there is some space for them to make some adaptations and to decide what shape and form the enforcement of the law should take. And we're also expecting that in January 2026 and in July 2026, there will be very specific guidance issued by the EU, in particular relating to sector-specific guidance and also the assessment of risk factors. So from May 2027 to May 2029, we start to see the CSDDD apply to companies that are in scope. There are different timelines depending on the size of the companies. So the largest companies with a certain threshold of employees will kick in 3 years, then a lesser band in 4 years, and an even lesser band, 1,000 employees plus, will be in 5 years from the date of July 2024. Next, please. So which companies are in scope? So the companies in scope are those that are established in the EU. They have to have more than 1,000 employees on an average and a net worldwide turnover of more than 450 million euros. It also applies to companies that are established outside of the EU, but they need to have a net turnover of more than 450 million euros in the EU. Now, there are also other companies that are not in scope, but that will be indirectly affected. And this is where suppliers of companies that are in scope could be indirectly affected by the application of this law to certain companies in scope. So these would be direct and indirect business partners of companies in scope. The directive also includes all business partners in the upstream supply chain, so from product manufacturing all the way to raw material sourcing, etc., and a select part of the downstream supply chain, so partners or suppliers that might be a part of the distribution, transport, and storage of products. Next, please. So before we talk about enforcement, I just wanted to let you know briefly, what are companies in scope required to do? They're required to assess the potential or actual adverse impact that their business activity can have on human rights or the environment. What that means is, understanding throughout their value chain, so upstream and part of downstream, what is the impact of their direct activity, but the activity of their business partners throughout the value chain on human rights and the environment. They're required to identify suitable measures in order to address any potential or actual adverse impact that they might cause. They're required to create the tools that are necessary to monitor the effectiveness of these measures. And finally, they're required to report back and to communicate internally and externally on the outcomes of the measures they have taken and on their risk profile. So that's quite a handful of requirements that companies in scope are required to comply with. So what is the liability for non-compliance? Brands are held liable for the adverse impacts that are caused by violations of human rights or environmental issues in the extended supply chain, so by their suppliers, and particularly if they cannot prove that they have complied with the CS3D requirements. There are penalties for non-compliance that could be imposed on brands, including a fine of a maximum of 5% of the net worldwide turnover. There are also other consequences, for example, the publication by member states of the list of non-compliant companies, which will be made public. And there's also civil liability action that can be taken by those who are aggrieved in the different member states. Next, please. So what are the potential implications for suppliers? By the very fact that a number of brands will be subjected to compliance with all of these, what we expect is a trickle-down effect that will sort of, make its way through the extended value chain in order to reach suppliers and sub-suppliers, etc. And these will take different shapes and forms. We are already starting to see in our practice, for example, that contractual assurances are being sought by brands to make sure that suppliers are going to comply with brands' policies and procedures in commercial agreements. We are seeing requests to comply with more stringent codes of conduct. And we're also seeing strengthened risk management systems and auditing processes. Because CSDDD also has a provision for enhanced stakeholder engagement, we are also seeing that brands are becoming a lot more interested in ways in which they can engage with the worker communities or the extended worker body of their suppliers and sub-suppliers. And that has also resulted in an enhancement of the number of worker voice tools that brands want to see deployed across the supply chain. The next part is setting up suppliers' policies and procedures. We are seeing a lot of supply chain mapping to identify sub-suppliers, subcontractors, and requests to develop suppliers' grievance mechanisms or to socialize the brand's grievance mechanism as an escalation mechanism. The idea is to just get a better handle on the way risk is mitigated through the use of grievance mechanisms, and also to achieve a better understanding of who are the brand stakeholders through the supply chain mapping. Then the disclosures and record keeping, because the requirements of CSDDD require, monitoring effectiveness and various other requirements, there is an enhanced request around data. So the request is to provide data such as demographic information, what supply chain mapping suppliers might be doing of their own supply chains, and a request to provide data on suppliers' policies and procedures, how effective are those, etc. We're also seeing a lot more requests for unannounced audits and a lot more deployment of the worker voice tools, as I mentioned earlier. And assessing the effectiveness of suppliers' processes, for example, how effective is their grievance mechanism, and keeping a record of these verification measures. Now, even though there might be contractual assurances in place, these would normally be supported by verification. So there will be a request of suppliers to provide information or evidence to support the assertions that they might be making to brands around their own systems and their own policies. Next, please. So some of the challenges with embedding essentially what is a systems-based change is the opportunities that come with it. And the law is clear that the idea is not for brands to be dumping on suppliers. They should not be passing on their requirement to comply onto suppliers. And with that in mind, the concept of shared responsibility between brands and suppliers is very much espoused in the CSDDD. And this takes a few forms. There is support built in very specifically for SMEs. There is a greater sort of, emphasis on purchasing practices being more fair. And, there's also an opportunity for the supply world to get a lot more organized in order to deal with some of the challenges that CSDDD will present. Next, please. So if we talk about support to SMEs in particular, brands are required to take into account SMEs' knowledge and also, the constraints that they have in potentially supporting the brands with compliance. They are required to provide targeted and proportionate support to SMEs' business partners. There is opportunity for SMEs to request support from brands on the resources, knowledge, and financial support that they might need. And this financial support could be anything from direct financing, low interest loans, but also guarantees to do business for an extended period of time, but also providing assistance with securing finance. Next, please. This one has generated a lot of interest, and I think in my daily practice, I see how remediation plans or corrective action plans that require suppliers to refund very high amounts of recruitment fees often cause a lot of issues, particularly where there isn't enough working capital to allow for these, unexpected and ad hoc payments. And one of the conversations we always have in those contexts is, why does the purchase price not reflect A, the cost of compliance, and B, the cost of recruiting workers, especially where there are shortages of workers locally? So bearing this in mind, the CSDDD suggests that brands should make the necessary changes to their business plans and operations, including purchasing practices, and that they should develop purchasing practices that allow suppliers to pay their workers living wages. It also suggests that the purchase price should also allow the suppliers to provide for just and favorable working conditions for their workers. And engaging constructively with brands and initiating conversations on changing practices, including purchasing practices, is something that we need to see more of. Unfortunately, in my own practice, what I'm seeing happening is there is a lot of requirement on suppliers already to comply with enhanced requests around providing data, upgrading their systems and procedures, but we are not seeing conversations happen around the purchase price and around who's going to shoulder the costs of many of these changes. Next, please. So getting organized and shared responsibility, in the spirit of shared responsibility, I think one of the really key areas for suppliers is to collaborate with other suppliers to share some of their resources and their best practices. Many of the challenges that you're likely to face are going to be very similar. And it's really important that there is a degree of sharing around some of how this is dealt with collectively, but also engaging with industry associations to develop a comprehensive and collective strategy in engaging brands around having those difficult conversations around purchase price and practices. It's really critical at this point in time, particularly as brands are getting organized with their own compliance efforts, that suppliers do gather momentum by engaging with industry associations. And it's definitely the case that there will be safety in numbers, and that it will put and position supplier conversation, arguments, and narratives in a much stronger position to do that. I just wanted to wrap up this piece of my presentation by saying that this essentially is a very big European dream of promoting a systems-based change around, identifying and mitigating human rights and environmental risks across supply chains. The degree of consultation with the producing world was extremely limited, as was the input of the producing world into the debates that went into this piece of legislation. The reality is that although it is the brands that are in scope, the trickle-down effect and the compliance of brands will rely very heavily on suppliers. And what that essentially means is that there will be costs associated with this for suppliers, and it is absolutely critical that there are some very important conversations that are had very soon around fairer purchasing practices and around what support suppliers might be required in order to ensure that this responsibility is shared and not dumped on suppliers. So I'll pause there for now, Kim. Back to you.
Thank you, Archana. And I'm going to hand over to Kyle from Crystal Group. So we're going to hear a little bit from Kyle on how Crystal Group has been preparing for CSDDD, the challenges that they've had, and their sort of recommendations to fellow manufacturers. And then we'll hear the same thing from Linda at Pactics. And Pactics and Crystal Group, as you'll hear in a moment, are two very different companies. So we hope that this sort of pairing of experiences gives a kind of window into lots of how, two very different types of manufacturing companies are approaching this, and then we'll go to Q&A. So Kyle, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So, can you hear me clearly? Okay, great. So thank you for having me today. This is Kyle. Let me introduce myself again. This is Kyle from Crystal Corporate Sustainability Department. Although it is still in this emerging stage, I would like to share with you or our dear fellows what we have taken and what we are planning in regarding to the CSDDD. But before delving into our preparations and work so far, I would like to give you a quick glance at our operations. Currently, Crystal has around 25 production facilities across 5 countries, including Vietnam. Vietnam is currently our biggest production base, and then China, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka. And as per our latest FY financial year, the EU accounts for around 17% of our market outlet. So this necessitates heightened attention to us on us, the potential implication of the CSDDD. Next, please. Although there are still uncertainties regarding the roles and to the suppliers, we have already started preparing in various aspects to address the potential challenges. First, we have set up a research and study team in-house to grasp the essences of the new regulations. For example, like the scope, the requirements, the potential impact on Crystal, and then we can identify the necessary preparatory work that we have to address to close the gap. In addition, we maintain a very close contact with all our brand customers to ensure that we can timely load their plans to these new regulations, which enable us to make necessary response and deployment of our strategy. Next, our corporate supply chain management procedures, including the assessment, monitoring, and training, are in place to address any key social and environmental risks, which we have been running for years already. And regarding the data management, we have an integrated data management system covering both social and environmental key KPIs. And we continuously refine our practices and coverage of this management system in order to ensure that it meets the rising data transparency requirements if deemed necessary. So next, please. Despite the preparation as shared, we anticipate that considerable challenges, there will be still considerable challenges. Firstly, as part of the supply chain of our brand customers, Crystal may face a series of requirements from our in-scope customers, which are mostly still uncertain today. Hence, you can see I put some question marks there, for example, like contractual assurance, more audit will be coming. Are there more data and information requests and related verification that we can expect? Expanding reference mechanisms, or will there be any supply chain mapping, in what level, in what material, to what extent? We are still keeping a close watch on these requirements from our customers. But on the other hand, while in the capacity as a company with the potential to have an annual turnover exceeding the revenue threshold in the EU market in the future, in case we become one of the in-scope company due to the future business growth, we will have to prepare the necessary due diligence policies and compliance framework. And for the required supply chain, social and environmental risk management, I think reviewing the current adequacy of our supply chain management procedure and mechanisms would be a key consideration to ensure we can fully meet the requirements of the CSDDD. This area also has rooms for collaboration with brands and upstream suppliers. And the last one, what assures me today, is that since 2022, Crystal has committed to the net zero by 2050 and has set our 2030 interim goal. So we already have a robust decarbonization roadmap for low carbon transition, which is being implemented rigorously and systematically. So regarding the climate obligation, I think it should be okay for our case. So next, please. Yeah. Finally, as already stated by Veron before, I would like to reiterate the importance of a multilateral communication among different parties. This includes coordination between brands and suppliers and our upstream supply chain, and even within the different departments of the company, of a brand, and of a supplier. This leverages the strength and efforts of all parties to develop action programs that are suitable for each stakeholder, stay alert to the new requirements and any upcoming changes, understand the challenges for pragmatic program deployment, and get prepared in advance. So as a manufacturer, I think the key is we should not underestimate the weight of our words. Although suppliers sometimes find themselves in a relatively passive position, which compliance efforts and costs are shifted to, but there is definitely room for us to strengthen our collective voice. And internally, the new requirements apparently are not solely the responsibility of a single department. So from our perspective, close cooperation between various departments, like myself from subsidiary department, I work closely with our finance department and logistics teams and the compliance and legal teams. It's also very indispensable to identify the gaps and to deploy the necessary preparation. So to close my part, I believe there is no better time than now to start our engagement. So that's all. That concludes my part. So pass it over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Kyle. And Kyle's recommendations, Ruby, if you could just go back one more on communication, both between manufacturers and also with customers, and sort of supporting customers to proactively align on how they're going to interpret different pieces of legislation, very much echoes the calls to action in the report. And there was a question in the chat about the slides, and yes, the recording of this will be shared with everybody who registered, but I really, really encourage you to go and look at the fact sheets themselves. Go and look at the report because there's a lot more detail. All right, I'm going to hand over to Linda to hear how Pactics is preparing, the challenges they're facing, and their recommendations, and then we'll open for Q&A.
Okay, thank you, Kim, and thank you, Kyle, for sharing your experience and recommendation as well. Kim already mentioned it briefly, and I think it's noteworthy to share that Crystal Group and Pactics Group are very different, especially in size, but still share certain similarities. So in contrast to Crystal Group, we have a sustainability of one, just me. And I hope this is an eye-opener for other suppliers, that we are all in the same boat and action needs to be taken no matter the size of the company. And I will address these topics during my presentation, but let me start with an introduction of Pactics first. So we can go to the next slide, please. Pactics operates out of a single production facility in Siem Reap, Cambodia, and we have a sourcing office in Wuxi in China. We produce eyewear accessories, travel and luggage, such as backpacks and shopping bags, and sportswear. And our customers are based in the EU and US, so legislation from the global north affect us therefore indirectly. Okay, we can go to the next slide, please. Our experience and the practical steps. I want to start with the steps that we have already taken. As already mentioned by the Remedy Project, companies become accountable for their social and environmental activities and mitigating adverse impacts. But before you can mitigate negative impact, it should be clear what the potential risk in your industry and supply chains are. So what Pactics did, we started to check general social and environmental risks in our sector. Therefore, we used a CSR risk check tool. We used a Dutch one owned by the Dutch government, but you can find several on the internet. And then you can select multiple industry, you can select several countries, and you can even include the countries where your suppliers are based. And then this tool gives you a list of common social and environmental risks in the sector and the countries you selected. And after identifying and listing these risks, we included this in our suppliers' audits and checked how they scored on the identified risks. And based on these audits, we can ask our suppliers what to improve. Well, this is the supplier side, but on the other hand, we have the customers. Also mentioned in the report and by the Remedy project is that customers will evaluate their supply chain, including manufacturers, so including Pactics as well. And it will, we believe that it will help you if you know upfront what you can expect from them. I think Carl said this also in his presentation, stay connected with your customer. This is why Pactics sent a survey to the customers to understand their sustainability journey. Where are they now? What are their goals? And ask what they see as the biggest social and environmental risks in the supply chain. Yeah, again, close communication with your customer prevents you from surprising requests and allows you to start collecting required information. And therefore, you also need documentation of your social and environmental activities of your own operation. And this is important as a supplier. Then the key challenges. This is also something Carl mentioned in his presentation. Supply chain mapping is a challenge. I think this is not only a challenge for this legislation, but also for other legislation that is coming. The textile and fashion industry has very complex supply chains, and getting an overview of these supply chains is a big challenge, maybe even the biggest challenge. To overcome this, we start with our 10 biggest suppliers, internationally and local. We select the most important ones to audit. We collect the information about their social and environmental performances. And then the next step, we can decide how to mitigate these risks if necessary. And then the top recommendations to fellow manufacturers. Actually, the recommendation I have is not only for manufacturers, but also for brands and other organizations. It's just start and collaborate. Checking risk in your industry and supply chain and organization helps you to understand where to begin. And for the topics that you already cover, ensure that the documentation follows European standards, because documentation is not only necessary for the CSDDD, but also for the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, the CSRD. We are not going into detail about this legislation, but I just want to mention it briefly that these two legislations cannot be seen separately, in my opinion. And doing good is one thing, but the good communication of documentation and communication about this is another. Plus, I think data collection becomes more rewarding when you're doing it for your own benefit as well. So setting up a system to collect these ESG data helped us to get a better overview and more insights in our own social and environmental performances, and eventually resulted in an annual impact report, which is on itself an invaluable asset. Then one more thing I would like to note, which is also a recommendation. I already mentioned it briefly in the beginning, the importance of collaborating and being in the same boat. Pactics has only a sustainability team of one person. So collaboration within the organization is very important, but maybe even more important is our collaborations like this with Transformers Foundation. Because you are connected with like-minded people and you can learn from each other, especially when you are a smaller group. You can take advantage of the ESG knowledge and experiences from other bigger suppliers. So what I want to say is, besides the collective voice, you can gain knowledge, and it's simply nice to discuss topic with like-minded people, especially when you do not have a team to discuss that with. Okay, that's it from my side. Back to you, Kim.
Thank you, Linda. And thank you, Kyle, and thank you, Archana. And Linda, on your last point, I would really echo that. You know, we put at the start of this presentation a bunch of QR codes up on the screen, and one of those QR codes was to support future fact sheets and updates to this guide. But what I would add to that is, and I hope it's okay if I speak a little bit on behalf of the group here, but you know, I think that one of the things that the individuals from the manufacturing companies that have led this piece of work have really gained is in some ways a little bit of community relationships. When they have a question, there's someone they can go and ask. And that the sort of knowledge that has been gained by participating in the creation of these guides and in these webinars is really kind of the first step to also collective voice. Archana, so I invite the audience to please put your questions in the question and answer box, and I'm going to kick off with a question, fairly straightforward technical question for Archana on the difference between the CSRD and the CSDDD.
Sure. So when these legislation were debated and conceived, there were two key things on the legislators' mind. One was to create an environment of transparency. How do you create transparency? By reporting, by increased flow of information outwards. And the second was accountability, by creating obligations on businesses and by there being consequences for the businesses. So as a result of that, CSDDD very much focuses on, here are certain obligations for businesses to understand what impact they have on people and the environment. And if you don't do it, there are certain consequences for not doing it. Now, CSRD is all about reporting and transparency. And that has, one critical component, and that critical component is the double materiality aspect, which is essentially the reporting covers two big angles. One is the impact on environmental and social issues that the business has. So that's content that you get from due diligence obligations in CSDDD. And then the second part of it is the financial materiality. So what are the financial implications for the company of these issues? So there are two heads around which the reporting happens. But for this reporting to happen, there is a lot that needs to go into it. There needs to be very sound due diligence systems from which you can get the data, you can do the analysis so that you can do the reporting. There is stakeholder engagement so that you really understand from a stakeholder's perspective, both top down and bottom up, over what risk looks like, how should it be addressed, etc. And you need to be reporting on that. So in a nutshell, the close relationship between the two is that the CSDDD processes generate a lot of the information and data that is necessary in order to do the reporting under CSRD. And CSRD is also very clear in guidance provided that the basis of preparation for this information and for the reporting is also key. And to add to the third pillar of transparency and accountability, you have sanctions. So this will be covered in the next webinar where we are going to talk about the EU forced labor regulation. And the intention of the EU forced labor regulation is to prevent any goods coming into or circulating within the EU that are linked to forced labor or child labor. And you start to get the idea that there is a reporting obligation, there's an accountability obligation, and there's a sanction tool. And the idea is that in time, all of these will mutually complement and reinforce each other. So I hope that helps to answer the question, Kim.
Thanks. And there was another question that came in, which I think you've kind of already addressed, but I'm going to throw it out there in case there's anything you want to add, which is, why do they need to be viewed jointly? So, I mean, is there anything you want to add on that? The CSDDD and the CSRD.
Yeah, I think just to say that it is the intention of the legislator that they be viewed jointly. It's a mistake to invest in CSDDD processes and due diligence, etc., and not to understand the context within which this can be used for the CSRD reporting. They're both very intimately linked, and the investment in one will support the other, and therefore they should be viewed jointly because actually the data gathering is shared through the CSRD.
Thank you, Archana. And just as a reminder for the audience here, we heard from Kyle and from Linda, but we have all of the suppliers involved in leading this piece of work. So if you have questions for any of them, almost all of them are here. And please, this is your chance. There's one more technical question, which I'm gonna put to Archana, but then maybe Kyle, you want to also add to it because I know in your presentation you kind of spoke to this a little bit as well. But the question is, did I understand correctly that the CSDDD is only relevant for in-scope companies within the EU, not the EEA, excluding the third party companies or third country companies? I'm not sure. So I think the question is around scope. Kind of like that the in-scope companies are only for within the EU and not the EEA. Archana?
I think just to say that everything that we've seen suggests that the distinction is EU and non-EU. So, you know, that tells you where the granularity lies. And if it's within the EU, there is a clear definition of who is in scope. And that's all we know. It's either EU or it's non-EU.
Thank you. Okay, so there's another question which is about KPIs for assessment. Is it what are the types of KPIs that you've seen? Is it document checks or is it site visits? And I am curious to hear from Kyle, but potentially also others, whether from other manufacturers sort of on this call, what your experience on this has been. And I'll start with Kyle, and if anybody wants to add to that, please jump in.
Thank you, Kim. So I can share more a bit about our existing practice at Crystal. So regarding the supply chain, I mean the audit or assessment to our suppliers, I think we are not just rely on just single, documentation review or on-site audit. We evaluate the risk from various channels like some online search, some communications with them, some desktop survey, or on-site inspection as suggested in the question. But regarding the KPI and the content to be included in the desktop audit or the on-site audit, we have integrated different requirements from the local regulations, from the industry best practices, as well as the customer specific requirements, and make it as a Crystal corporate standard. So we try to make a corporate standard as far as practicable to cover all the necessary requirements from different parties, both from the legal and both of the customers. So yeah, and our corporate department is responsible for the implementation of this supply chain management procedure.
Thank you, Kyle. Does Kavita, I think
Yeah.
I see. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. So in terms of what's actually happening with us as a supplier, different customers are, some are a bit more on top of it, some are a bit less. The ones who are not sort of properly on top of it are probably relying more on documentation at the moment. And there are other brands, who are asking us for actual on-site audits, even ethical, even technical audits. So the KPIs are extending now from just, documentation based or chain of custody, for example, or transparency in ethical audit reports, to actually going with their own audits often. So that is causing the challenge of different brands are coming up with different audit
mechanisms. Some are asking even for technical audits going into the upstream supply chain. And again, that is bringing in the challenge of costs, resources in regions as well. So both things are happening at different levels of engagement from different brands, depending on how engaged they are already in tackling, what's coming with these directives.
Thank you, Kavita. Anybody else wants to from the manufacturing or supplier side want to add on this? And there's no pressure. Okay. Then I have there's a related question in there about which third-party audits and assessments are acceptable for CSDDD. I am going to, Kavita, do you want to speak to that one? And then if anyone else wants to jump in, you can.
Yeah. So the clear differentiation is between, of course, the ethical audits and also the technical audits. So the ethical audits will cover your social aspects of it, how your upstream supply chain is complying with all the legislations when it comes to whether it comes to forced labor, etc. So there are different audits like the CDEX, SMETA, those are the most common ones which people are accepting. In terms of technical audits, we find that for most companies who are coming to us for technical audits, they're coming up with their own audits. So, specific audits for them. And when it comes to environmental audits, a lot of brands are relying on the HIG. So the HIG FEM modules or even the HIG FSLM modules are acceptable for ethical and for environmental audits. So this is what we are finding mostly. Amorphy is also one of the audits that is acceptable. They have a module for environmental as well in there. So it really depends. What we are trying to do is engage with our brands and trying to direct them to accept existing audits rather than create their own audits.
And thank you, Kavita. And actually, this relates, there's a question that came in on, where is it? Here, from Catherine, it says, my question is as follows. Have you seen any interest from brands to coordinate their efforts in designing mechanism for complying with CSDDD? So what I would just sort of emphasize here, to Kavita's point, is there's manufacturers themselves, I think, play a very critical role in helping to push this. And one of the key calls to action in the guide is for manufacturers to basically proactively seek to engage their customers and sort of nudge them towards interpreting and operationalizing this in the same way. And very practically, one of the pieces of work that I would really like to see happen is for manufacturers to potentially even put out, for instance, a guide for brands on how they think the CSDDD and the CSRD should be operationalized. I think that would add a lot of value to the sector and is very much in line with the kind of calls to action both in the report and that we heard from Kyle and Linda. There's a lot of questions, so I'm going to keep going. Back to, there's a question for Archana and also potentially any of the suppliers on the call who want to expand on it. It says, the CSDDD specifies that any measurable environmental degradation needs to be accounted for. That sounds very broad. Oh, sorry, it's not a question for Archana. Kyle, Linda, and potentially other manufacturers on the line, how do you approach this? And I'll start with Kyle.
Actually, but before I answer this question, sorry, Kim, I would like to add something to the last question. So regarding the monitoring to the supply chain, I think in our case, I would like to share that I think most of you are also coming across. Actually, our suppliers, our upstream suppliers can be categorized into own sources or nominated by the brand customers. So to make it more effective to monitor or to to mitigate the potential risk those nominated suppliers. I think it's inevitable that we have to voice to the customers to see the good approach to monitor those self-nominated suppliers, because it would be more easy for them to listen to our approach. So back to this question regarding the visual environmental degradation. I think I'm still figuring out what exactly this CSDDD is referring, but currently we are utilizing different tools to monitor, to record any quantifiable discharges. I mean, those from our operations or from associated facilities, including the air emissions, wastewater, and then any electoral resources depletion. But as of today, we cannot confirm whether this kind of measurement or monitoring suffice the requirements, but we have to keep in view the upcoming specifics from those legislators or from whether anything we have to further build up. So make it less rigid. I mean, the current approach makes it less rigid, but more dynamic to accommodate to the future needs. This is my my observations as of today.
Thank you, Kyle. Does anybody else want to add to this, or? And there's no pressure. We've got a lot of questions, but if you want to, you're most welcome.
I want to add something on this question. So for us, actually, the customer did not specifically ask for anything in the CSDDD, but I think what is important as a supplier or what we did is we made an environmental action plan, or actually an impact action plan, both on social and environment, to set goals and KPIs to improve your environmental and social impact. And I think in this way you are upfront and to make sure that there are no surprises when the customer will ask.
Thank you, Linda. There is a question from Bapi that's come in, which is, as suppliers, we are forced to sign quite restrictive contracts with the brands. There's no choice for us to negotiate the abusive terms, as it's always take it or leave it. Besides, there's an airtight NDA that prevents us from sharing about it on relevant platforms. Wondering if CSDDD has any scope to cover this aspect. I'm going to put this question first to Archana from the legal perspective, and then if any of the suppliers on the line want to share if and how and whether they're managing to do this in practice. I know it's a sensitive subject, so I'll leave it open as to whether you have anything you'd like to share on that, Archana.
Sure, thanks, Kim. You know, it's something that, you know, we've been keeping a keen eye out for. I think what the CSDDD does have is fairly innovative provisions around, you know, purchasing practices, the importance of living wage, etc. However, the terms of the CSDDD are not firm enough in order to help overcome some of the structural difficulties, for example, the NDAs, the difficulties to shift that conversation and bring people to the table to talk again, unless in the July 2026 and the January 2026 guidance are a lot more clear and firmer on this subject. That's why I go back to what you mentioned earlier, that the guide around what suppliers think the implementation should look like would be really useful, because a lot of these issues are not thought through carefully enough when guidance is articulated. So that would be really beneficial. One of the things that could happen is there could be filings with the regulators in relation to coercive brand practices that may be leading to difficulties in bringing brands to the table to talk about purchase price, etc. So that is there. Brands are very aware of it, and you know, it is a legal and a reputational risk for them, particularly as non-compliant companies are going to be made public. So, you know, there will be that risk there, and that might prompt brands to be more amenable to conversations. It's certainly better than having nothing, but do I think it's strong enough and forceful enough? Not without further guidance that will make it a lot more effective.
Thank you, Archana. And I'm conscious of time. So for those of you both in the audience and panelists who want to stay on another couple of minutes or are able to stay on a couple more minutes, I would invite you to do so and we'll get to more questions. For those of you who have to go, I just want to thank you for being here. And I also want to thank Linda and Kyle and Archana and all of the other suppliers who have supported this piece of work here with us today for being here today. And not only being here, but also being candid with your insights, your struggles, your challenges, your thoughts, because it is not easy. And I hope that it inspires all of the manufacturers calling in to do the same. And so with that, I thank you. And for those of you who want to stay on and can stay on, I'm going to keep going with maybe one or two more questions. Before I do that, any sort of burning things from any of the panelists here today, that things you want to say that you haven't had a chance to say?
Yes,
Okay.
I'd like to add in a few more inputs. I'm referring back to the question from Bapi here, and also my answer will cover a few thoughts for next question by Farhan Ahmed. Um, you know, in my past experience, in my past like a decade of experience in the sustainable cotton sector mainly, what I realized, there has been a lot of talks about encouraging brands to adopt forward commitments. I mean, addressing the purchase practices and policies, the existing ones. And there is a disconnect between the sourcing side, the buying side, and the compliance or the ethical sourcing teams. And to bridge those kind of gaps, we have also been offering product prices inclusive of the sustainable initiatives costs. So, I mean, there are a few models that are being talked about in the industry today, that when we are discussing the seasonal projections with the brands between suppliers and between buyers, we could, offer prices with the surcharge built in, and also to explain them in the open costing or the breakdowns, the surcharge built in for the sustainable initiatives that are going in for addressing all the policy regulations requirements. So those are, and forward commitments. Those are some of the ideas I'd like to throw in. Also, overall, I feel supply chain traceability and mapping is the first thing to start for any supplier of any size. And I have realized, or we at Sourcery have understood, that once the supply chain has been built, mapping it from top to bottom is far more complicated than initiating the mapping from bottom to top. While we are starting the season or starting the sourcing exercise, it is easier to continue to, digitize the supply chain. And at the end of few months, you will have a completely mapped out supply chain. Those are some of the recent learnings that we have had, and we very strongly support and encourage everyone to take that. There are several mapping and traceability platforms or supporting organizations who provide those services. Sourcery is one of them. We are coming up with a Connect app. But other than that, supply chain mapping bottom to top can be an answer to managing a very, very fragmented supply chain. And that could cover a lot of the unorganized bit or the chaos that gets built in and gets difficult to manage by the end of the product. So those were some of the inputs I wanted to share. That's all.
Thank you. And we're really out of time, but I'm going to ask, there's one more question. I'm going to try and answer some of the questions in the chat. But there's one more question I wanted to answer live because it's something that we haven't talked about yet, and that is on data ownership. So what is the legal standpoint on ownership and confidentiality of data from the value chain required for the CSRD and risks of false claims? And I think this is a really important point, and at least me personally, a question that I'm seeing increasing conversation about amongst manufacturers, because manufacturers are the ones who are paying for the data platforms, paying for the people to input the data into those data platforms, the ones in many cases paying for the goods stuck in customs when the when the data is not sufficient. And in some cases, then there are then third-party entities who are maybe even making money off of that data. So Archana, I want to ask you from the legal standpoint, does the CSRD or the CSDDD have any sort of point of view on data ownership and confidentiality?
It doesn't. It's silent on that subject. There is no guidance out from the regulators on this subject. I think the one thing that is understood is, for example, with CSDDD, if there is data relating to workers or to people, particularly as they come through grievance mechanisms with filing grievances, that confidentiality has to be respected. So it's okay to make disclosures that are general, but that don't go into the details of people because they're protected by data protection. But that's about it, really. And I think, like you, I do feel this is an area that really needs to be clarified. There are several concerns around, competitive information coming out and people not being free to own their own data and data passing hands in an insecure manner.
Thank you, Archana. All right, with that, I am going to close this webinar. I'm frantically trying to put last questions, typed responses in the chat. But thank you very much for being here. We hope to see you again in December at the webinar on forced labor. And my final call is please, please read the fact sheets, because all of the information to many of the questions that are being asked are in the fact sheets. And we know it's a heavy lift. Nobody wants to read the fact sheets. It's not fun. But the information is there. So I really recommend that you look at that. And I can say that it's not fun because I've read them far too many times. But yes, so please do that. And thank you again to everyone. And with that, I'm going to close the session.